Today, I'm going to take a closer look at Toronto's irrationally exuberant real estate investors. My name is John Basalis, president at Realosophy Realty. Catch all my latest writings on Toronto's housing market at movesmartly.com. If you find this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all my latest videos. So earlier this month, I was asked in a article from an interviewer and a journalist whether Toronto is in the middle of a housing bubble. And my answer in short was probably not. And I'd said probably not because most of the growth that we've seen in house prices since the start of COVID has been driven largely by homeowners and home buyers who tends to live in their homes. COVID just pushed a lot of demand forward. So demand significantly exceeded the number of listings that were available for sale. And that's largely why home prices accelerated. And that's an important point because in bubbles, usually the demand is from optimistic or irrationally exuberant, as they've been called, real estate investors, where investors are the dominant buyers in the market and they're the ones that are pushing house prices up. Now, while for most of 2020, the demand for housing or the growth in the demand for housing has been driven by end users, things have started to change in 2021 gradually. As more investors have been jumping into the market, looking to make gains, rapid house price gains and capitalizing on the appreciation we're seeing. And it's this shift in demand trends that's leading me to think that we're moving closer towards a market that's driven by investors and sort of the exuberance of investors rather than just sort of fundamentals, demand from end users. So, what does sort of irrational exuberance kind of look like on the ground when we're looking at the housing market? And I'm just going to pick one example that a lot of real estate agents have been circulating online. I think it's an interesting one. We're going to look at a 512 square foot condominium at 1080 Bay Street in downtown Toronto. And we're going to look at kind of the same unit sales, different floors, of course, but pretty much the same size. And we'll look at the history of sales since December of 2018 for this particular unit. So if we look at this, next chart, prices for this unit in December 2018 were about $648. And the dots on this chart represent actual sale prices. And prices remained balanced until February 2021, when the sale price for the same unit was $700,000. But since then, prices have really accelerated. 2 months later, in April, a unit sold for $755. In October, another unit sold for $830. And in November 2021, a unit sold for $890,000. So how does a unit go from $700,000 in February to nearly $900,000 9 months later? I mean, what is driving this? And this is kind of an example of what I see as sort of this irrational exuberance that we're seeing in the market. When we look at some of the causes of this growth, it's really not necessarily rents. I mean, rents in the GTA for this unit specifically, and then this next chart, actually declined because of COVID, have since rebounded in the summer because of the strong demand from students. But at the end of the day, when we look at the change in rent prices and the change in the sale prices, I mean, rents are up about 10% compared to December 2018, whereas the sale price is up 37% since December 2018. So, the growth in prices is not really driven by rents alone. There's obviously something else that's going on that's driving these prices up. And it's hard to say that it's anything fundamental other than this expectation that prices are going to keep going up. And I think that's the key thing when we think about growth in house prices when it's driven by investors. I mean, prices tend to just keep going up until as long as there's another investor around the corner willing to pay a higher price. Now, when we look at the specific unit at a purchase price of $890,000, and we look at the rent on it currently, which is about $2,500, if we look at sort of the carrying costs as an investor, assuming they have a 20% down payment and a 30-year mortgage, the carrying costs are about $3,500 a month compared to the rent, which is $2,500. So you're basically, as an investor, out of pocket about $1,000 a month. And from the investors, we here see a lot of them don't really care about sort of losing $1,000 a month because they don't see that as a loss. They see that the mortgage is paying down the principal. And of course, they have this expectation that it's just going to be worth another 80, 70, 80, 90, $100,000 a year from now. So this is really what's driving a lot of the demand we're seeing from investors, this hope that their investment is going to be worth an extra $100,000 over the next year. And one thing I'll say is that the growth that we're seeing in investor demand is really not just in the downtown condominium market, although I mean that is certainly one sector in the pre-construction sector that's important to keep an eye on. But we're seeing it across the GTA. This tweet I'm going to share from Ron Butler, who's a prominent mortgage broker, talked about a client of theirs who purchased a pre-construction townhouse in North Ajax for $712,000 14 months ago. Today, the property's valued at $945,000. So, on the ground, what are people looking at? They're looking at buying a home, and within, 14 months, they've made over $200,000 basically tax-free. And these types of price trends are what leading a lot of people to become real estate investors. And interestingly enough, earlier this year in February, I spoke to a class at Ryerson's real estate program at their business school. And, it ended with a Q&A. And the Q&A is very interesting because the instructor, the professor, basically got all the questions, consolidated them, and asked me. And the most popular question she got was, what advice do I have for people who want to buy a residential investment property, which I found quite fascinating, because I would have thought that, when I'm speaking with a bunch of, university students, people who are, going into the job market, their primary concern would be, how do I afford a home to get into this market? But that wasn't everyone's concern. Everyone wanted to become a real estate investor and just wanted to know how. And these trends, I mean, if you look at historical housing bubbles, it tends to be not positive trends when there is this sort of speculative mood in the housing market. Now, a lot of these anecdotes I'm talking about actually line up with the data. So TerraNet is a company that manages Ontario's land registry system, and they published a report that basically broke out all of the purchasers of residential real estate into various segments, multiple property owners. So investors is one, first-time home buyers are another, people who are moving from one home to another are another. And the interesting trend that they noted was that real estate investors are actually the dominant buyers in Ontario's housing market right now. So they make a biggest share out of all the other buyer segments. And not only do they make up the biggest share, they're actually the only segment that has seen their share of purchases increase in 2021. Every other buyer segment is seeing their share of purchases actually decline. And this kind of speaks to what I'm talking about, the fact that the growth in demand in 2021 has largely been driven by investors. Of course, there are still end users, but we're seeing more and more growth in people wanting to buy investment properties in 2021. Now, there's a few things kind of worth touching on. When we think about the rapid acceleration in prices, a lot of economists and analysts will talk about, well, this is justified because we're not building enough homes. There's just not enough supply in the market. And this, of course, is not an entirely honest answer. I mean, we only have to look at housing markets that have a very elastic supply, markets like Phoenix, like Las Vegas, like Dubai, and those cities, having an elastic or a very a supply of housing that isn't constrained, say, by zoning, for example, did not prevent those cities from having an unbelievably rapid acceleration in prices in 2006 and 2007 before the global financial crisis. So those cities experienced significant housing bubbles and then significant crashes. And the reason they did is because when investors are the dominant purchasers in a housing market, no amount of supply is ever going to be enough, because if there's always an optimistic investor around the corner, it doesn't matter how many homes you buy, there's just always going to be another purchaser. So that's the other important thing, one important thing worth reminding ourselves of. The other is that a lot of economists are arguing that the strong demand from investors is justified because they add more rental supply into the housing market. I mean, this again is not entirely accurate. Again, I mean, we have to look at the impact that investors are having on prices, and then all this is sort of based on the assumption that all of them are renting them out, which we know on the ground is not entirely the case either. So we have to be kind of cautious about the impact that investors are having on the housing market, because again, when we look at sort of the trends we're seeing now, they're very reminiscent of the trends we saw in the GTA in 2016 when investors were dominating the demand. So, when we look at how this is going to impact the market in the future, that's the challenging part. Bubbles or these exuberant markets can go on longer than many might think, and longer than they should. So we don't know how long this is going to keep going on. And the fact is, as long as there are more investors and there's cheap credit out there, that's going to continue. Rising interest rates might cool that trend down, of course. But one important thing to keep in mind is that one important factor that's going to impact how long this goes on, of course, is the increase or the change in rental income. Because unlike house prices, rents are truly constrained by household income. A lot of people think house prices are constrained by income, and if they were all bought by end users, they might be. But when they're bought by investors, sort of the income constraint no longer applies, because cash-rich investors are no longer constrained by income the way households are, whereas rents are truly constrained by income, which means that, yes, house prices in these buildings can keep going up 10, 15, 20% per year, but rents are not, because rents are only going to go up is based on how much people can afford to rent them. So basically, this whole acceleration in demand from investors tends to slow down when the gap between the price and the carrying costs and the rents is too high for people to justify. And that's usually one of the factors that leads to this slowdown. And then basically, investors start slowing down, pulling out of the market or selling their investment properties because the spread is too high. Right now, the gap is being helped by the fact that interest rates are very low, but as interest rates increase, that's going to kind of increase the sort of the carrying cost of these investment properties. So we might see more investors unloading some of their units if their costs start getting too high. So those are some of the trends we're keeping a close eye on the market. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions about this, please post them in the comments below, or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.